Starfish Education. This is part 3 of the series on how to develop student-centered design challenges. In today's video, we're going to talk about preparing the challenge and also assessing the challenge. For preparing the challenge, we've already done some of the pre-work. We have already established a challenge statement. We've already hopefully looked at the standards that need to be aligned to, and we've looked at and established criteria and constraints for our project. So now that we've checked to make sure that we have everything together, there are a couple more components that we need in order to finish preparing the challenge. The first is tools and materials. So you'll need to have a list of tools and materials that students will use, and then you'll need to think about how they're going to use them. So are you going to put them all at the front of the room for community supplies? Are you going to give each group of kids a bin of materials to use? Are you going to build budget into your project? Something else that you'll need to think about is debrief questions or discourse questions. So this is a step that a lot of people usually skip, and it's really unfortunate because debrief or discourse questions are one of the most important components. What they do is they help to establish what kind of misconceptions have taken place. It's really important for us to address these misconceptions so that we make sure that students have an accurate view of what the science concept is that they're learning. And debrief and discourse questions help us get there. There are 3 different types of questions that I like to use when I formulate discourse or debrief questions. The first of which is a what question. What questions help students to be able to process general facts? So we're simply asking them about some sort of recall. The second level that I like to use are why questions. Why questions dig a little bit deeper because they get students to not only recall the fact that they learned, but it also asks them to process it and make sense of it. And the third type of question that I like to ask is a how question. I like how questions the best because those give me the most insight into student understanding. How questions not only ask kids to make sense of things, it asks them to apply the knowledge. So when kids apply the knowledge, that means that they have a much better understanding than if I were to just simply ask them about fact recall. So I like particularly to ask those 3 different levels of questions because when I get answers from students, it helps me understand a little bit more where students are on sort of the learning continuum, and thus helps me know how I can better help my students. For the Inky example that I've been using throughout this video series, some debrief example questions that I might use might be, how does your team's design meet the provided criteria and constraints? Or perhaps, if you had a larger budget for Inky's habitat, what other aspects do you think that you would add to your design? These are just a couple different examples of questions that I might ask students to further probe their understanding. Now that we have all of our components put together, we'll want to write those up in a design brief. A design brief is basically a STEM lesson plan that we use for design challenges. And this is important because we'll want to have all of those pieces of information at our fingertips. The last thing that we'll need to talk about today is assessment. And we talked a little bit about assessment in the prior video about thinking how we were going to assess. And now it's time to really build that piece out. So you'll determine whether you're going to create a rubric for students, whether you're going to have students come up with the rubric with your assistance, whether you're going to assess students through STEM notebooks or a presentation or a poster or however you're going to assess them. There's so many different ways that you can assess a STEM project. Generally though, it comes back around to using some sort of rubric. When I use a rubric, I like to have 3 distinct sections. In the first section, I like to have my science content. So anything that the kids would need to learn that's related to the standards. This second section, I like to assess teamwork and student collaboration. And in the third section, I like to assess student individual contributions and attitude. I find that by using a rubric in that fashion, it allows me to really hone in on the development and the understanding of each particular student. Throughout the video series, I've been using Inky the Octopus as an example to show how to develop student-centered design challenges. When you write your rubric, the very top portion will be your science content, which means I'll list any performance expectations that I want students to be accountable for. Depending on what grade level you teach, you might include the performance expectations on animal habitat or on animal external and internal structures, and you'll definitely want to make sure that you include the performance expectations for engineering design. Thanks for joining me. Come back soon for part 4 of the series on introducing and facilitating the challenge. For more STEM tips and resources, visit Starfish Education and sign up to stay connected.